Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladin Neurotech.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Donna Hamlin, and she is an executive coach, I guess you could say, and has helped some good friends of mine with their neurotech companies and guide them through this process, mentor them through this process of being a leader. So I guess leadership coach, or what would you, so first of all, thank you for coming on and talking about leadership a little bit, but how would you describe yourself?
Well, coach is part of what I do, for sure. My interests are about improving performance in organizations. So leadership is a component of that, but it's also about teams and how they work together, whether there's a leader identified or not. Many teams don't have a leader. They have to figure all that out. And my early work wasn't even that. It was more about creativity. When I first had my first professional job at General Electric, I was very interested in what creativity could do for businesses. And I was doing some studies to take a look at when is it creative and when is it not. And I did an analysis of people in different types of jobs to find out where there's high creativity or not. When I did this little testing assessment tool and sent it out, who do you think came out as the highest in creativity? Imagine.
I don't know. Maybe somebody who's been stifled, who wasn't allowed to be creative?
Librarians. And I started scratching my head. Why a librarian? Why wouldn't it be the people in R&D or the artist? Or it was the librarian. And I looked at that and started to understand for the first time that creativity is defined as putting together unrelated items for a new constellation in a useful way. Think about the job of the librarian in the old days. It's different today because you go online. But then you went into the library, you're looking for some information, and the librarian helps you find it. And so all day long, the librarian is learning something that the librarian wouldn't know anything about otherwise. And all day long, they're picking up more and more bits of information about things that aren't tied to their normal days. And it's all up there in their heads. So when you give them a problem, they're pulling from all these different dimensions that we in our routines don't have. And so they problem solve much better. Now, artists do that when they are dealing with a lot of information from different sources as well. One graphic artist I work with is a genius in this, but he's getting information from all these different directions. So I got interested in, if we're going to build creativity in our work teams, then take the engineers and give them books to read or materials and magazine articles of things totally unrelated to their work. If they're trying to solve a particular problem on technology, but they're reading a book about boating, or they're reading a menu for a really cool dish that's Mexican or something completely unrelated, that's going to change their creativity. And we started testing that with engineering groups, and darn, it worked. So,
wow. Yeah. So those librarians were almost like human Googles, and just having all this random stuff come at them, and it's kind of inspiration.
It's really important to know that if we want to be good at our work, then we've got to explore things outside of our normal swim lanes. And when we do that, it gives us a different view or another way. Now, the other way to do that, of course, is to surround yourself with people who think differently than you. You'll get there without doing all that extra work yourself. But you do have to know how to engage with people who think differently than you in gracious ways so that you benefit from it. And it's all about conditioning yourself to stay always learning, always asking, so that you're constantly coming at things in different ways. I had a gentleman who just wrote his bio. He wants to get on a board, and he sent me his bio. And I looked at it and I said, Peter, it's a good executive bio, but that's not what directors are looking for when they want to add another director on their board. You have to emphasize the things that you're going to bring to the board table, not what you did as an executive. And he wrote back and he said, oh, yeah, I guess I still have my brain on executive mode. And I just wrote back, tilted. Just tilt your head. And he did, and he rewrote it, and it came out much better. So sometimes we have to get out of our groove and do things that are so unrelated to what you know that you actually learn something, which is
God forbid.
just try it another way, or surround yourself with the people who do it differently so that you can ask them. One of the things that's great about what you're doing right now when you're interviewing people is you're learning as you go. And every time that I was doing research on market research, I would always ask lots of in-depth questions of the people outside the category of what I needed to know. Because if I'm talking to a bricklayer and then I'm talking to somebody who's a helicopter person, and I ask about their jobs so that I can learn without having to do it myself. But you get those dimensions in life and then you become more creative yourself just because it's all rolling around up there.
Interesting.
Now, what's that got to do with leadership?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Why creativity? Why leadership? How are those two things connected?
The leaders who can inspire creativity increase the amount of innovation in their operations and their delivery of products and services. So if you're not a particularly creative person yourself, but you know how to manage the encouragement of creativity within your organization, then you're going to get those results. So great leaders know that, and they know how to create that belief in the culture. One of the great executives I worked with had a sense, he owns a large enterprise that competes with Walgreens and some of the others, but in the South. And he could see around the corner enough in the industry to say, what we're doing isn't going to be sustainable. We have to come up with something new. But I'm just not creative enough, he said, to think of it myself. He brought in 15 of the top people in the organization, which he handpicked. And he said, I just know we're going to hit a wall here. And I don't have the answer, but I trust you to think this through and come back and tell me what we should do. Now, that's not only a vote of confidence, but it's an invitation to use your creativity. They went away, they came back with a model. He looked at it and he said, I'm scared, but we're going to do it. Their business has tripled in size and grown like you wouldn't believe in terms of regions and what have you. And that group is so loyal to him because he trusted them to take it on, and they gave the best they could, and it worked out. That's a good leader. You don't have to have the answers as the leader. You have to know how to create the possibilities for the people that are working with you. That's the real value.
Would he have been a good leader if it didn't end up well? Like if everything went to crap, then would that have been a success as well?
Ultimately, I mean, provided you have the confidence in your own organization and your people to say failure is a teaching principle and we'll move from there. And certainly the great, crazy inventors of the world fail many times before they actually get to the success that they want. Not everybody's wired for that. It's a question of how much risk appetite you actually have as a leader, what you can afford to risk by experimentation as opposed to a reliable, predictable outcome. Now, not every business industry is going to need that much crazy experimentation. You wouldn't want that in your regulatory IRS. You wouldn't want them fudging with your numbers. But if you're looking at a product, I'm working with a gentleman now who is creating the designs with an engineering team to send kits into outer space that have the supplies that the people that are now wanting to go into outer space can go get the supplies they need floating around in outer space. Now, if that isn't like the coolest thing in the world this week to be, all right, I've got a lot of money, I've got a lot of time, I want to play. Now, if they mess up the first few things they send up into outer space, is there a lot of downside to that? Probably not. But it's a great place to be in life when you can afford to use things like that as a playground.
Yeah, exactly. Be be a little bit more experimental. Yeah, so you have a lot of experience, and like you were saying before, with different types of leaders. Basically, you're talking about board members or executives. We also, on the podcast, we talk to a lot of professors, company leaders, not necessarily like CEOs of like big companies, smaller companies, maybe some leaders in government agencies or something like this. Are there differences in this? And how should one think about approaching being a good leader or being the ideal leader in all these situations?
Those are cultural differences in terms of the natures of the businesses themselves. So first you have to understand your own style and your orientation to problem solving and the way that you function and add value. And then you have to fit one of those cultures that makes sense for you. So it's about self-reflection first, which is why I spend so much time with people taking a look at what is your orientation, because there are 5 key styles. And if you know yours well enough, then you know where your fit is. Now, there is some evidence that some styles can be laterally applied. So you may say, this is my space, this is my sweet spot, this is where I do really well. But you can transfer it and switch to a different industry or a different cadence of the life cycle of the business and still do well. But people, once they find that it's a groove and it's working really well, they tend to stay in it. Now, you can switch if you want to. You can try it and you'll find out that, oh, it works here too. But it isn't for everybody. So what people do is they grow into a groove and then they excel their career ladder within that groove. Not most switch.
Are you limited to a specific type of job based on your predisposition, or could you change, or could you bring another predisposition, personality to that same position and be successful?
Well, both are yes to your questions. You can be in one category of work and then be transferred into another and be very successful. You'll see that in examples like a lawyer who goes into HR. And one is the regulatory protocols, and the other is about understanding the psyche and the groove of the culture. And it's much more empathic than it is compliance issues that you're looking at. And they can be very successful. It'll surprise you sometimes when you see that. But it's less about the career that's informing you. It's about where you're comfortable and what you're willing to do. I have a sister who's a family court judge. And because of the nature of her work, she's listening to family stress and complaints and blah, all day long. Now, I had a problem, big stressful problem, and I went home to get some loving and hugs from my family. And my sister said, what happened? And I told her, and she said, cut it out like cancer and move on. I listened to that all day long. I said, I'm going to go get a hug from my other sister. She had no empathy for this because that's what she deals with all day. So she's the wrong person to share it with for that obvious reason. Now, would she have empathy if her son had that problem? Probably. She wouldn't have done that. But if you are too much of one thing, you don't have a tolerance for it in another. Like HR people say the job is great, except for the people, because they get too much of it. And then they get a little envious of people that don't have to deal with the psyche of people day in and day out. And I can get really curious when I watch people who love doing things that I would never want to do. There's a gentleman that's here right now that's under the floor in the basement doing some wiring work. And I talked to him for a little while and he said, it's my favorite job. Why would you want to go into the basement where the rats are and go through all that dirt and love that job? I'm not that kind of person. And we all know what we aren't. But it's really good to learn from the people who have a different job what compels them to do that and what gives them pride in what they're doing. I don't know this person very well. I mean, he's servicing the business. But if I really sat down and spent some time, I'd learn something from that.
Yeah, that really is interesting. Different strokes for different folks. And I've felt the same thing. It's theoretical math for me. And people apparently do that for fun. And I just don't understand that. So you mentioned 5 different types of, leadership styles. Do you want to go through these and explain what each of them are a little bit?
Sure. There's 4 main ones. One is an orientation to strategic thinking and what should we be doing. So it's the more creative side of life, in that people who have that think nothing is impossible. And they love to create new answers or solutions or products or directions. And they're very positive people, and they're excited by brainstorming and inventive thought and abstracts. And they have 90 ideas before breakfast. They're so excited about everything. And that's one style. And they get impatient with people that are getting into the weeds a little bit, because they want to be in that inventive stage. Those are great high energy people. And they have a big appetite for risk. So they don't mind breaking something just so they can reinvent it. It's fine. And they get people all frothed up, and it's got a lot of fellowship in the quality of that. Now, there's another style that's called a challenger, which is someone who's very good at articulating and seeing, this is where we are, and this is where we want to be. So they can envision it for people. It's here, we're going here. And they can get fellowship with that, but they're not necessarily as gifted at how to do it, which is why they partner really well with someone who's creative. Because if the person can say, we need to get from here to here, and they're stubborn about that, and they get a lot of marching orders for people, and they organize them, but it's the what that they have to partner with to do that together. And that they become a dynamic duo as styles when you put those two together as leaders. There's another that is a style that's called a unifier, which is, or a uniter, whichever language you want to use. And it's about the one that understands people really well, and they're good at understanding and building the working rapport with each individual, so that they can say, I know exactly what team to put together. I know them well. I know what their assets are, their strong suits. I can put the right team together. And they're very good at holding teams through their own respect and their relationships, hold their feet to fire on their social mores. So if there's a team and somebody's monopolizing the conversation, they can say, now, Sam, we've heard a lot from you, but we'd like to hear from Leighton now. And they can get away with that because they're very diplomatic. And so people will allow them to be checked, if you will, through that style. They are about harmony. They want groups to have not just a vote where the majority wins. They'd like to see concordance on that. So they do a lot to build out an understanding of the values and the thinking of the group so that they get much more of that harmony. And then there are people that are just very focused on the swim lane that they're in, and that's what they want to do, and they're experts in it, and they are so committed to that area of work that they tend not to look at the rest of the things that are going on. And if you see somebody who is a dynamo and that's their full commitment and that's what they're here to do, that's a style too. It's very committed to one topic or one approach to things. Now, they need to be stretched a little bit if they're going to experience life, or they may have a factor of a worry factor. I coached a gentleman a number of years ago who never smiled. He always had a frown on his face. And I said, you really need to find something that gives you joy. And he said, I wouldn't have a clue what would give me joy. Everything about him was this moral responsibility to do everything right. And it was so driven in his head on morality and rightfulness and making sure that nobody's disappointed. And so when he said, I wouldn't have a clue what to do to give me joy, I said, maybe we'll make it a moral imperative that you learn. And he looked at me and laughed. He says, you're turning my thinking on my head. And I said, yeah, that's the job. And within a year, he had figured it out. And you can see him on his LinkedIn, and he's joyful, and it's great. So sometimes you have to take what people have and turn it back on them so that they can see the difference between the two. There's an exercise that's great called appreciating your vices. If you can identify a vice that's something of yours, and then you can go teach some group of people how to do that vice really well, then you start laughing at it because you realize how silly it is. And I went through this years ago with an exercise. It was about making everything much worse than it really is, just taking it writ large. And I was with a small team, and we had all said, okay, we're going to teach this class on how to do this really well. And the first thing that happened the evening before was that we made all the notes on sheets and what have you. In the morning, we were supposed to do this session. The guy who had the papers never showed up. Of course that happens. Bad things happen. We hyperbolize it and we make it worse. Of course. That's the first example. And then the next was, I had come to that workshop without knowing what the topic was going to be, but my t-shirt that day was Les Miserables. I said, see, I even came dressed for the event. And then we're teaching people the biggest and most important letter of the alphabet for hyperbolizing is oh no, oh God, oh, just everything is oh. And we went through and trained, everybody's laughing and laughing. When you start to realize that you do this and you can teach somebody else it, then you stop doing it because you realize it's funny and that there are better pathways to get things done. And that's what good leaders and executives do. They figure out where their patterns, which are rational, are not as effective as another way of doing it. And then when they shift, they're better leaders.
That's really funny. Yeah, I guess being able to laugh at something or laugh at yourself also takes away its power. So that could be a good way to really minimize bad habits or something like this. What are some big mistakes, or what's the biggest issue that you see with leaders? Again, you work more with CEOs, but maybe we can expand it out to other leadership roles as well.
I'd say that one caution is to make sure that leaders are having fewer opinions and more questions. When you've got an opinion, you're not learning and you're not inventing. You're declaring and you're dictating in some ways by virtue of the influence that your opinion would have on a team. But if you're asking questions, then you're engaging people in a process where everybody's learning and the outcome is stronger than if it's just a mandate. So that's one thing that I look for. I encourage people to say every day, ask and ask some more. The other thing is to not get in a groove. There's a little exercise where if you pick up the newspaper in the morning and you read it, and then you put it down, and you pick it up and read the things you skipped, because we have biases in what we want to learn on any given day. And so we read typically what we like to read, and we skip the stuff that looks like it might be boring. But if you read the stuff that you think might be boring, you're going to learn something. So try and expose yourself to stuff that's outside your groove. It's just going to make you a better thinker, or it will teach you to consider different factors than you might otherwise have ignored. And the rest is about stretch. There's an exercise where you say, stand here and just, can you reach your hand up to the top? And people will do that. And then I'll say, can you stretch a little more? And of course they can. And I said, why didn't you do that in the first place? So leaders have to set an expectation and then stretch if they want to see a difference, as opposed to good enough, as opposed to always say what's better than good enough, which is a discipline to develop because we get lazy or we get comfortable. And if we are constantly reminding ourselves, putting a little mantra on your computer that says better than that as a way of a mantra for yourself, then you'll break that pattern and you'll start to create the expectation for that for other people, which is really important. We have, as executives and leaders and board directors, a duty of curiosity. You constantly got to be asking the questions. And these subject matters that are getting complicated, like AI and cybersecurity and big complex problems like that, we can't know. It's the same with neuroscience and other things. There's so much yet we don't know. The only way we're going to discover is if we start asking more questions and probing and exploring it together. So we have to be students, always students. And we can never be smart enough, so we got to keep asking.
Yeah, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you speak. And I guess that can be difficult potentially for some leaders. Maybe if they surrounded themselves with yes men, or if they have a lot of power, then they're used to people just going out and fulfilling whatever they might order. But yeah, no, I guess it is important to be able to do that. Is there any other exercises that we can do in order to strengthen those muscles of listening more?
I would say the things to do are to read things that are outside your bubble. Just pick something up that's completely unrelated to what you do. That will help. There are lots of mental puzzle games and things out today too that you can also do if you want a little break from your day. And the other technique that I'm finding is go for a walk and separate yourself from everything you're doing, because some of the best ideas come when you take your break. And a walk is about all it takes. That's when you're going to get the ahas that you've been struggling because you're so focused. It's when you let it go that it comes to you. Those are all things that work. And if you're used to a certain kind of music, change it up, because that's where you're going to put yourself in a different place, a different zone, and it'll just come across in a whole different light. I have a dress that was given to me by a woman who has been a model in her earlier career, fashion model. She picked it out. It's nothing I would wear, nothing, but she gave it to me as a gift. I get more compliments on that dress. It's not how I see myself, but it's how somebody else saw me. And when I wear it, I get compliments. That's the sort of stop a minute. I look at myself totally differently than somebody else does. I need to know what that means. Those are the sorts of little lessons that you benefit from every day if you keep open and explore it with other people. That's why 360s are part of executive coaching, because you're getting feedback from the way other people are looking at an executive. And then you have to cope with that and say, all right, what does that mean? Is it because I am not communicating who I am well enough? Or is it that I'm not behaving in a way that's effective? Those are decisions that you simmer down and say, all right, I'm going to make adjustments now. Or I'm going to be much clearer about who I am because the integrity is missing. Who I am, I'm not projecting well enough. Those are choices that we make.
What is a 360?
360 is when an executive coach, or you can do it internally too, but handpicks with the executive 5 to 6 people that work with that person routinely. It could be new people and it could be people longstanding, and you do an in-depth interview about the experience of working with this person. And then you summarize all of that into some themes and sit down with the person to say, okay, this is what's coming out of this. Let's talk about what we can do to make you a stronger leader as a result of it. And there's strengths, and then there's some opportunities for development. And typically in that process, you're getting raw feedback about what that experience is through a third party. So as a coach, I can hear all of that and synthesize it into some patterns. Anybody's feelings getting hurt, we're dealing with the raw truths of coaching, which is what you need to be a better coach. You have to be vulnerable. You have to make yourself vulnerable.
That sounds like a pretty in-depth process, but it sounds very useful. But again, something that maybe only a very committed leader who really wants to improve themselves that they might actually go through. Like that doesn't just happen.
A lot of companies do it. 360s are part of many cultures now. Many companies are doing it. Larger companies were doing it more, and then it started to get picked up. In some of it's mandatory. If you're a VP and above, you have to go through the 360s as part of your duties as an executive. And it's also required in public companies that the board have a 360 done of their CEOs. So we do a lot of those. And there's a lot of diplomacy issues when there's things that the directors are going to have to keep working with the CEO, and they want some course correction, but they don't want to have a fight about it. So the third party can get that information through in a neutral way, and then the CEO knows what to do to adjust to accommodate the needs of the board. And it's funny, some of it's little stuff and some of it's just insensitivities or delicacies that need to be done. There's a CEO recently who, because of COVID and the directors couldn't come together, he had shipped out some very expensive bottles of wine for the long day that they were going to have together over Zoom. And one of the directors is saying, well, this isn't our money. This is the company money, and they shouldn't be doing that. That $20 bottle of wine is different than a $250 bottle. And the two directors are very uncomfortable. That was an overspend. And the CEO was just trying to be gracious. But I had to explain, if you're going to do that, maybe you could get a less expensive model and it'll still be a courtesy and everybody will be grateful. You don't have to go over the top like that. And he had no idea. But he said, of course I won't do that again. But those are the sorts of little things that can get in the way, whereas the other things might have to do with proficiency or transparency of certain information that needs to get out. When you have a third party to do that, it's much more effective because everybody still has their camaraderie. They don't fight about it. Nobody's got hurt feelings and all the things that otherwise might get in the way of the group dynamics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you have any other more stories how maybe this 360 or this kind of social gaffes were changed or improved by having some sort of outside perspective?
I think you've got to be able to stay open to feedback, whatever way it comes. It can come through a coach, it can come through life. One of the best lessons I had when I was in my early 20s, I was trying to help a client that was trying to raise money. And I had put a deck together and I'm meeting with this prospective investor and I'm 23 years old. And he was asking questions that were already in the deck, answered in the deck. And I was getting really impatient. And I said, look, it's already there. Didn't you read it? I got snotty. And he said, Jesus, Donna. And I said, what? I'm right. And he said, yeah, but your style sucks. And I got it. I got the head slap. I realized that I had screwed it up for my client by being snotty and impatient. And I'm so glad I got that lesson at 23 because it informed my style going forward. And I never did that again, ever. So when you get that feedback, even if it's blunt like that, it's so valuable. So just say thank you when you get feedback, whether it's positive or negative, just say thank you, because that will change what you're going to do in the future. And I loved that guy. He was a great friend for years and years. I named all his thoroughbred racehorses for him. It's just one of those things. You taught me something important and I'm going to do this back. So
yeah,
I
really,
stay vulnerable.
It's painful, but yeah, you're right. It could be much more painful later. And you suffering through the pain now is much more beneficial than having to do it in the future when the stakes are much higher, potentially. Hopefully, if you're progressing in life, that means the stakes will be higher and higher the further you go along.
Yep. Just take it all as lessons and say thank you. If we had more grace among us all, we'd get a lot more done.
Yeah. Interesting. So do you want to talk about your company? What do you do? And I guess how you got into it too.
Sure. We do both management consulting and board work. And what we're focused on here is creating better performing enterprises and businesses and organizations. And it's either through the talent development and the leadership in management or through the governance model. And we do a number of different projects that are classic for management consulting firms. So we'll look at their operations performance, we'll help them with their brand and their identity. We do a lot of market research in those areas. And we've won a couple of awards for the techniques that we use because it's a lot tied to the psychology of the buyers and understanding what they are looking for in a different way to map it than maybe what the reputation was before. And we've gotten some dynamo results from that. So that's work that we really like to do. And fortunately, we ended up doing work in 52 countries. So there's a lot of international appreciation for what culture does to businesses. And that's informed and made things even better. I mean, we're constantly learning ourselves. On the governance side, we started that as a enterprise activity when all of the banks and the collapses were happening and so much was churning in governance. And we said, this needs attention. So we now work with boards on their performance, looking at best practices in governance. We identify candidates that would be good for board placement in certain companies. And then we also certify and prepare people to serve on boards. So all of that is about understanding leadership and styles and problem-solving gifts or skills that, when brought together, create a higher performance. And that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, it's very interesting, very niche. I hadn't really heard about it before, but I'm glad that we met and connected. Yeah, maybe as we're finishing up, do you have any stories of the most radical transformation of like it's on fire and spiraling out of control, and then you say that one thing, and then everything's better?
Oh, I don't know that I have an example like that. There have been some challenges that were big. One example is a company that was acquiring two other companies in totally different countries. There's a US company that's acquiring a company in China and in the Netherlands. And they were bringing the three engineering groups together, not because the platforms of the technology were going to be additive. These engineers were going to have to pick one platform. Now imagine you've got engineers that are in love with their babies, and they were strangers to each other and were going to have to come together and make a very big decision. Two are going to lose. And the head of the R&D team said, I have no idea how to do this. So I pulled them all together the day before the real meeting and gave a mixture of teams where they were 3 people or 6 people, whatever, from these 3 different countries. So they're meeting each other for the first time in these little team meetings. And they were given a sheet of things they had to go and find. They had all afternoon to find them. Now we're in Shanghai, and they were either things they had to find or things they had to do in videotape. For example, you've got a guy from the Netherlands with a person from the United States and then one Chinese person, and they had to go find a policeman and have him sing a German beer song. And, another one had to find the tallest building in this city and take a picture from the top. Crazy stuff that they had to do. They spent the whole afternoon doing that. And then they came, and at dinner, each team had to present what they did and what the outcomes were and what the results. There was just tons of laughter. And then the next day, they had to make a big decision together, and they did it. We baited all of the pros and cons, and they did it. They made a clear decision, and everybody was happy. R&D guy said, what happened? And I said, I made them human first. And now they're colleagues. And now they're making serious decisions in rightful ways. Those are big risks. I didn't know if it was going to work. I'd never done it before, but it did, and I'm grateful. But people have to be willing to try. And I think that's where we want to be in the world, willing to try.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. If we knew the answer, if we knew what was going to work and what wouldn't, then we'd all be very rich people. But
and bored.
And bored, exactly. Yeah. So we have to be willing to try these things. So Donna, this has been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this. I've already heard a few other leadership, seminars or kind of instructions with another project that we're working on in our CEO mastermind, our peer support groups. So that's been very interesting. But before we go, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
I would just invite anybody that wants to learn more to feel free to reach out and give me a call. I'm always available.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.